Hello all, it's Grandma here. I have something different for you now. I'm going to read from a book, and I'll read from one chapter at a time. And this book is Little House in the Big Woods. And it's about a little girl who lives in pioneer times when people lived in log cabins and things like that. And she is, I think she's about 5 in this book. And it's a very interesting book. So here's the first chapter. This is Little House in the Big Woods, and there's some really pretty pictures. There we go. There's their cabin, and Ma and Pa, and her sister Mary, and there's Laura, who looks like she's skipping. Her name is Laura Ingalls. And this is a chapter from Little House in the Big Woods. Once upon a time, 60 years ago, been more now, a little girl lived in the big woods of Wisconsin in a little gray house made of logs. The great dark trees of the big woods stood all around the house, and beyond them were other trees, and beyond them were other trees. As far as a man could go to the north in a day, or a week, or a whole month, there was nothing but woods. There were no houses, there were no roads, there were no people. There were only trees and wild animals who had their homes among them. Wolves lived in the big woods, and bears and huge wild cats. Muskrats and mink and otter lived by the streams. Foxes had their dens in the hills, and deer roamed around everywhere. To the east of the little log house, and to the west, there was miles and miles of trees, and only a few little log houses scattered far apart in the edge of the big woods. So as far as this little girl could see, there was only one little house where she lived with her father and mother and her sister Mary and their baby sister Carrie. A wagon track ran in front of the house, twisting and turning out of sight in the woods where the wild animals lived, but the little girl could not know where it went or what might be at the end of it. This little girl was called Laura, and she called her father Pa and her mother Ma. In those days and in that place, children did not say father and mother or mama and papa like they do now. At night, when Laura lay awake in the trundle bed, a trundle bed is a kind of bed that the mattress, the bed part, slides underneath another bed during the daytime, and then you pull it out when you want to use it at night. At night, when Laura lay awake in the trundle bed, she listened and could not hear anything at all but the sound of the trees whispering together. Sometimes, far away in the night, a wolf howled. When he got nearer, he howled again. It was a scary sound. Laura knew that wolves would eat little girls, but she was safe inside the little house with the solid log walls. Her father's gun hung over the door, and their good old Jack, the brindled bulldog, lay on guard in front of it, and her father would say, "Go to sleep, Laura. Jack won't let the wolves in." So she snuggled under the covers in the trundle bed close beside Mary and went to sleep. One night, her father picked her up out of bed and carried her to the window so that she could see the wolves. There were 2 of them sitting in front of the house. They looked like shaggy dogs. They pointed their noses at the big bright moon and howled. Jack paced up and down before the door, growling. The hair stood up along his back, and he showed his sharp, fierce teeth to the wolves. They howled, but they could not get in. The house was a comfortable house. Upstairs there was a large attic. It was pleasant to play in when the rain was drumming on the roof. Downstairs was the small bedroom and then the big room. The bedroom had a window that closed with a wooden shutter. The big room had two windows with glass in the panes, and it had two doors, a front door and a back door. All around the house was a crooked rail fence to keep the bears and the deer away. In the yard in front of the house were two beautiful big oak trees. Every morning, as soon as she was awake, Laura ran to look out the window, and one morning she saw in each of the big trees a dead deer hanging from a branch. Pa had shot the deer the day before, and Laura had been asleep when he brought them home at night, and he hung them high in the trees so the wolves couldn't get the meat. That day, Pa and Ma and Laura and Mary had fresh venison, which is a word for deer meat, for dinner. It was so good that Laura wished that they could eat it all. But most of the meat must be salted and smoked and packed away to be eaten in the winter, for winter was coming. The days were shorter and the frost crawled up the window panes at night. Soon the snow would come. Then the log house would be buried in snowdrifts, and the lake and the streams would freeze. In the bitter cold weather, Pa could not be sure of finding any wild game to shoot for meat. Bears would be hidden away in their dens, where they slept soundly all winter long. The squirrels would be curled in their little nests in hollow trees, with their furry tails wrapped snugly around their noses. The deer and the rabbits would be shy and swift. Even if Pa could get a deer, it would be poor and thin, not fat and plump like the deer are in the fall. Pa might hunt alone all day in the bitter cold in the big woods covered with snow, and come home at night with nothing for Ma and Mary and Laura to eat. So as much food as possible must be stored away in the little house before winter came. Pa skinned the deer carefully and salted and stretched the hides, for he would make soft leather of them. Then he cut up the meat and sprinkled salt all over the pieces as he laid them on a board. Now, standing in one end of the yard was a tall tree, a tall length cut from the trunk of a big hollow tree. Pa had driven nails inside of it as far as he could reach from each end. Then he stood it up and put a little roof over the top and cut a little door in one side near the bottom. On that piece he cut out, he fastened leather hinges, and he fitted it into place, and there was a little door with the bark still on it. After the deer meat had been salted for several days, Pa cut a hole near the end of each piece and put a string through it. And then Laura watched him do this, and she watched him hang the meat on the nails inside the hollow log. He reached up inside the little door and hung the meat on the nails as far up as he could reach. Then he put his ladder against the log, and he climbed up to the top, and he moved the roof to one side, and he reached down to hang meat on those nails. Then Pa put the roof on again and climbed down the ladder and said to Laura, "Run over to the chopping block and fetch me some of those green hickory chips, new, clean white ones." So Laura went to the block where Pa had chopped wood, and she filled her apron with fresh, sweet-smelling chips. Just inside the little door to the hollow log, Pa built a fire of tiny bits of bark and moss, and he laid some of those chips on it carefully. Instead of burning quickly, the green chips smoldered and filled the log with thick, choking smoke. Pa shut the door, and a little smoke squeezed through the crack around it, and a little smoke came out the roof, but most of it was shut in with the meat. And here's some pictures of this log. And it's all propped up, and they're feeding chips to it. And there's Laura with her apron full of chips. So they're putting chips in the log in the fire. "There's nothing better than good hickory smoke," Pa said. "That'll make good venison that will keep anywhere in any weather." Then he took his gun, and slinging his axe on his shoulder, he went away to the clearing to cut down some more trees. Laura and Ma watched the fire for several days. When the smoke stopped coming out through the cracks, Laura would bring more hickory chips and Ma would put them on the fire under the meat. All the time there was a little smell of smoke in the yard, and when the door opened, a thick, smoky, meaty smell came out. At last Pa said the venison had smoked long enough. Then they let the fire go out, and Pa took all the strips and pieces of meat out of the hollow tree. Ma wrapped them carefully in paper, and she hung them in the attic where they could keep safe and dry. One morning, Pa went away before daylight with the horses and wagon, and that night he came home with a wagon load of fish. The big wagon box was piled full, and some of the fish were as big as Laura. Pa had gone to Lake Pepin and caught them all with a net. Ma cut large slices of flaky white fish without one bone for Laura and Mary. They feasted on the good fresh fish, and what they did not eat was salted down in barrels for the winter. Now Pa also owned a pig. It ran wild in the big woods, living on acorns and nuts and roots, and now he caught it and put it in a pen made of logs to fatten it up. He would butcher it as soon as the weather was cold enough to keep the pork frozen. Once in the middle of the night, Laura woke up and heard the pig squealing. Pa jumped out of bed and snatched his gun from the wall and ran outside. Then Laura heard the gun go off once and twice. When Pa came back, he told them what happened. There was a big black bear standing beside the pig pen. The bear was reaching into the pen to grab the pig, and the pig was running and squealing. Pa saw this in the starlight, and he fired quickly, but the light was dim, and in his haste he missed the bear. The bear ran away into the woods, not hurt at all. Laura was sorry that Pa did not get the bear. She liked bear meat. Pa was sorry too, but he said, "Anyway, I saved the bacon." The garden behind the little house had been growing all summer. It was so near the house that the deer didn't jump the fence and eat the vegetables in the daytime, and at night Jack came and kept them away. Sometimes in the morning there would be little hoof prints among the carrots and cabbages, but Jack's footprints were there too, and the deer had jumped right out again. So now the potatoes and carrots and beets and turnips and cabbages were all gathered and stored in the cellar, for the freezing nights had come. Onions were made into long ropes and braided together on their tops, and they were hung in the attic besides the wreaths of red peppers strung on thread. The pumpkins and squashes were in piles in orange and yellow and green heaps in the attic's corners. The barrels of salted fish were in the pantry, and the yellow cheeses were stacked on the pantry shelves. Then one day Uncle Henry came riding out of the big woods. He had come to help Pa butcher. Ma's big butcher knife was already sharpened, and Uncle Henry had brought Aunt Polly's butcher knife. So near the pig pen, Pa and Uncle Henry built a bonfire, and they heated a great kettle over it. And when the water was boiling, they went to kill the pig. Laura ran and hid her head on the bed and stopped her ears with her fingers so she could not hear him squeal. "It doesn't hurt him, Laura," said Pa. "We do it very quickly." But she still did not want to hear that squeal. In a minute she took out one finger cautiously out of her ears and listened. The hog was no longer squealing. After that, butchering time was great fun. It was a busy day with much to see and do. Uncle Henry and Pa were jolly, and there would be spare ribs for dinner, and Pa had promised Laura and Mary the bladder and the pig's tail. As soon as the hog was dead, Pa and Uncle Henry lifted it up and down in the boiling water until it was well scalded. Then they laid it on the board and scraped it all over with knives, and the bristles came off. After that they hung the hog in a tree and took out its insides and left it hanging to cool. When it was cool, they took it down and cut it up. There was hams and shoulders and side meat and spare ribs and belly. And there was the heart and the liver and the tongue and the head to be made in head cheese, and a dishpan full of little bits to be made into sausage. The meat was all laid out on a board in the back door shed, and every piece was sprinkled with salt. The hams and the shoulders were put to pickle and brine, for they would be smoked like the venison in the hollow log. "Oh, you can't beat hickory-cured ham," said Pa. He was blowing up the bladder. It made a little white balloon, and he tied the end tight with a string and gave it to Mary and Laura to play with. They could throw it in the air or pat it back and forth with their hands, or they could bounce it on the ground and they could kick it. But even better than the balloon was the pig's tail. So here they are with the bladder. It makes kind of a balloon ball sort of thing. So that's something they had to play with. So now comes the pig's tail. So Pa skinned it for them carefully, and into the large end he put a sharpened stick. Then Ma opened the front of the cook stove, and she raked out hot coals onto the iron hearth. And then Laura and Mary took turns holding the pig's tail over the coals. It sizzled and it fried, and drops of fat dripped off and blazed on the coals. Ma sprinkled it with some salt. Then their hands and faces got very hot, and Laura burned her fingers, but she was so excited she didn't care. Roasting the pig's tail was such fun that it was hard to play fair taking turns. At last it was done. It was nicely browned all over, and how good it smelled. They carried it out to the yard to cool it, and even before it was cool enough, they began tasting it and burnt their tongues. They ate every last little bit of meat off the bones, and then they gave the bones to Jack. That was the end of the pig's tail. There would not be another one until next year. Uncle Henry went home after dinner, and Pa went back to his work in the big woods, but for Laura and Mary and Ma, butchering time had only begun. There was a great deal for Ma to do, and Laura and Mary helped her. All that day and the next, Ma was trying out the lard in big iron pots on the cook stove. This means that she was cooking things and making the fat in them melt so that it would drip out, and then that would make lard, which is a grease stuff that's kind of like butter. Laura and Mary carried the wood and watched the fire. It must be hot, but not too hot, or the lard would burn. The big pots simmered and boiled, but they must not smoke. From time to time, Ma skimmed out the brown cracklings. She put them in a cloth and squeezed out every last bit of the lard, and then she put the cracklings away. She would use them to flavor Johnny cake later. Johnny cake is kind of like cornbread. The cracklings were very good to eat, and Laura and Mary could have only a taste. They were much too rich for little girls, said Ma. Ma scraped and cleaned the head carefully, and then she boiled it until all the meat fell off the bones. She chopped that meat fine with her chopping knife in the wooden bowls, and she seasoned it with pepper and salt and spices. Then she mixed the pot liquor, which is kind of like a gravy, with it, and she set it away in a pan to cool. When it was cool, she could set it into slices, and that was head cheese. The little pieces of meat, lean and fat, had been chopped into had been cut off of the large pieces. Ma chopped and chopped and chopped until it was all chopped fine. Then she seasoned it with salt and pepper and dried sage leaves from the garden. Then with her hands she tossed and turned it until it was well mixed, and she molded it into 9 balls. She put the balls in a pan out in the shed where they would freeze and be good to eat all winter. That was sausage. When butchering time was over, there was sausage and head cheese and big jars of lard and a keg of white salt pork out in the shed, and in the attic hung the smoked hams and shoulders. Now look at here. Here's Laura and Mary playing in the attic. You can see the ham. There, that's a ham. It's all wrapped up in cloth and it's hanging there. And they've got their onions are hanging there. You can see, and their pumpkins are in the attic. So the little girls are playing up in the attic with all of their food. The little house was fairly bursting with good food that was stored away for the long winter. The pantry and the shed and the cellar were full, and so was the attic. Laura and Mary must play in the house now because it was cold outdoors and the brown leaves were falling from the trees. The fire in the cook stove never went out. At night, Pa banked it with ashes to keep the coals alive until morning. The attic was a lovely place to play. The large, round, colored pumpkins made beautiful chairs and tables, and the red peppers and the onions dangled overhead. Hams and venison hung in their paper wrappings, and all of the bunches of dried herbs, with spicy herbs for cooking and bitter herbs for medicine, they gave the place a dusty, spicy sort of smell. Often the wind howled outside with a cold and lonesome sound. But in the attic, Laura and Mary played house with the squashes and the pumpkins, and everything was snug and cozy. Now Mary was bigger than Laura, and she had a rag doll named Nettie. Laura only had a corn cob that was wrapped in a handkerchief, but it was a good doll. It was named Susan. It wasn't Susan's fault that she was only a corn cob. Sometimes Mary let Laura hold Nettie, but she did it only when Susan couldn't see. Now the best times of all were at night. After supper, Pa brought in his traps from the shed to grease them by the fire. He rubbed them bright and greased the hinges of the jaws and springs of the pans with a feather dipped in bear's grease. There was small traps and middle-sized traps and great big bear traps with teeth in their jaws that Pa said would break a man's leg if they shut on it. While he greased the traps, Pa told Laura and Mary little jokes and stories, and afterwards he would play his fiddle. The doors and windows were tightly shut, and the cracks on the window frames stuffed with cloth to keep out the cold. But Black Susan, their cat, came and went as she pleased day and night through the little swinging door of the cat hole in the bottom of the front door. She always went very quickly so the door would not catch her tail when it felt shut behind her. Now one night, Pa was greasing his traps and he watched Black Susan come in, and he said, "Now once there was a man who had two cats, a big cat and a little cat." Laura and Mary ran to lean on his knees and hear the story. "He had two cats," Pa repeated, "a big cat and a little cat. So he made he made a big cat hole in his door for the big cat, and then he made a little cat hole for the little cat." There Pa stopped. "But why couldn't the little cat—" Mary began. "Oh, because the big cat wouldn't let it," Laura interrupted. "Laura, that is very rude. You must not interrupt," said Pa. "But I see," he said, "that either one of you has more sense than a man who cut two cat holes in his door." And then he put away his traps and he took his fiddle out of the box and began to play, and that was the best time of all. Okay, that's the end of that chapter, and the next chapter is about winter, and I think you'll like that one. Have a good evening. Bye.